nhớ rằng ý trong bao nhiêu mà chùa cho linh sự tường ta nó cứ ya hóa này cả rồi sẽ đã tạo tân trí này rồi sầu hóa sẽ cho nó nếu nào cứ là nhận ra đã nên cho lùi chùa tổn chùa rồi biết sẽ là tổn lắm thọ nó sẽ là cộng kia là gì nó cũng tiếp liền. The gurgle of the water alerted the horse waiting by the pond, and the animal neighed loudly. The earth shook, and the land split in half as Shooking emerged from the opening with Jialia in his arms, covered in blood and dirt. The wave of the water lifted uphill and washed over them, both as he jumped onto the ground, still holding her. The horse galloped toward them as he pushed her onto the animal and got up behind her. They rode through the dark forest where the opening had a sealed door. Shooking jumped off just as the hissing of whispers was heard all around them. He watched in horror as ghastly-like figures rose from the dirt and formed beings with swords cutting at him. Jialia screamed out a warning as the portal door opened, and King Kietu and the men-at-arms appeared before them. Shooking ushered the horse holding Jialia outside as he and the men surrounded the opening with their swords. King Kietu said as he gave Shooking a smile. Shooking replied with a grin. The men raised their bow and arrow and began firing at the demon army that came their way. The arrows struck out limbs and heads, but the army still made its way toward them. Shooking! Look trong your dog Jialia yelled from the other side. Before Shooking could think what his uncle was going to do, the man pushed Shooking out to the other side and raised his sword. He said as he gave Shooking another shove, and the demon army began pulling him into the ground as the door portal began to close. Chitao! Shooking cried as he tried to reach for his uncle. The door portal began to make its descent, and Jialia reached out, grabbing his arm, pulling him back into hers as the door closed, and the last image he saw was of his uncle's bloody face with a grin as he faced the army of demons. The night sky was filled with stars as Shooking sat on a log, facing the flames of the fire before him. He was back in the army bracket with his men-at-arms, coming to terms with the loss of his uncle. He hadn't expected the man to sacrifice his soul for him. The image of his uncle's grin was forever imprinted in his mind. He felt drained, exhausted, and his head ached. He saw the shadow loom over him, and he recognized the shape of the body. He reached behind him and pulled his wife into his lap, inhaling her scent. The moment he broke free from the spell and his vision returned, his world came crashing down. He remembered trying to be strong, and then he woke up with blood all over him. His scars had returned to his face, a spell that made him believing things were real, but in reality, it was only a mirage. The only real thing was what he held in his arms at this very moment. Tatsi, he whispered. King. She touched his face. Cô bảo cả. Cô yên chân tia, cô nhìn chị ô lên đầu tia. Cô bảo tia yêu chị mô lì giả sư. Khai cô sao? Cô nhớ bà đó chị lì. He tightened his hold around her and let out a deep breath. Cô nhớ cơ. That's she. Yêu cô hỏi. Chạy yêu ô tối tôi nên nhớ rề cùng đó. Chẳng cô lo hình. He felt her body stiffen inside his hold. She turned to find her eyes shimmering with tears. He reached over and touched her cheek gently. Jialia, so ya cô bảo thế bao, ôi cô sát tia. Thế ra luôn thế nó, một câu tí lần thế này đã hù là sư. Lời tôi nên kiến chơi, cô yêu chỉ sát sao là. Ấy có hà lý có, nhiều sai tao lý cả tia. He didn't answer her. Instead, he reached and held her. The images of what he saw, when the Demon King showed him who was behind the betrayal, burned in his mind. How could he tell her the truth? How could he reveal what he saw without hurting her? The plan he had been thinking of would destroy her, and if he allowed her to stay with him, her heart would break. His hands began to shake as he thought about how to fix this, But no matter how many ways he thought of, he couldn't figure out a way to make things right without sending her away. Keeping her away from everything was the only thing that would make it right. So he swallowed down his pride and decided to make her think the worst of him. He pushed her off of him and stood up, his back to her. Cô bảo hai tia cô những chỉ trong tan trọ cho ya đó cô Lucia. Thế she cũng chẳng chỉ tao hai tia. Cô yêu lưu tụ nâng lúa học kia. Còn nó khai tao được cô hai tia. Giờ cô yêu khai đến bảo lý cả. Cô yêu kinh bảo tư. Nhưng nhớ mua ý tư là cho của tao của sao share cặp lon tài. She stood up and reached for his hand. Sure kinh. Khai đó cô. Kia cũng đã có chỉ luôn ra mà. Sao dài cô. Cô yêu có bao cô yêu có share na. He gently removed her hand from his and turned to look at her with an emotion that she didn't understand. And then he looked away and said, Taki, kuyo sagam da kanya ka sinyo. Mula itsi. Gently I felt her heart quicken, and she walked to stand before him. Kahali ka? So ya chishino, udu kito tala. Kuchen yo chagu kiro da gata lo. Ya ku ta wada chi choka. Ya chi mo ku tu na la ja ka ya ka tu to la na. O ja ka cho ke she ka yo chin jo ku cha ke ba ka li. He turned to her and glared at her. Cơ bà tao xả cho, để tới rau cụ tứ chỉ xả tao có cho cái bán à. Cụ yên rong xía nhớ lúc nâng chính cho chỉ bó con à. Tears filled her eyes, and she reached for him, but he backed out of her touch. She gasped, unbelieving what was going on before her. Anger filled her, and she turned him around, shaking him. Yo, đi chả đâu có là, lũ nhiên cho ta là ná, giờ vì đi chả có hậu đi nọ. Chả cụ yên cho cho giải à đi có, cô mua cái mua xía, yên mua xí sừng gạo nè. Giờ vì đi chả nọ. Khi họ chứng được cụ số kinh. Giờ có một bằng sĩ tia, khi họ chứng được cụ. He removed himself from her and said in a deep, regrettable voice, Họ chứng, giờ để cô luôn ninh, giờ mua có, giờ chủ chỉ sống mua cụ. Giờ luôn đâu nào chứng mua có lần đó cụ nâng thia, cụ yên chỉ lúc họ tổ sư. Lý nào đó, ôn ninh nhỏ nà, bố mua lần tư xã tàu. Chỉ nếu cụ giờ tàu có là cho, cụ luôn ninh, cũng cho kia cái tổ sư. Cụ thua thao là, lúc nào mà cụ cho có những muốn chia cả hai chán đủ khó tư là, chỉ là cụ tâm mừng. She started sobbing, and she slapped him across the face. Nâng xếp hệ. Cụ yêu từ mất xếp chấp lờ đồ có, thấu cơ chừng ti tàu đó mốt của bỏ chơi giá có chỉ khu sĩ kia thế. Rau cơ ya, xin lúc nào mù, có thế cụ yêu yến chúa, có chừng là ti của thế vậy của có xa đá kia. She turned and began walking away, her heart breaking in half as she tried to process what had just happened. She screamed and began running down the hill, slamming her fists into the ground. Was this the story of her life? To be in pain, to be miserable, to carry such anguish forever. The moment she thought she had found the one man who would love her through life and death, and in an instant, he had turned around and changed his emotions, as if everything they had shared meant nothing to him. She heard the thunder that cried above her and felt the raindrops against her skin, staining her body as her heart tore, and she eventually gave up and let the darkness take over her body. Shirking watched from the top of the hill, and his hands clenched into fists. He fell to his knees and began sobbing. Cô tìm mi ta ra. Cô thọ xì mèo. Giờ cô chịu ôli nó, kiến chế có bao cô lũ hợp phía ra tận đây nó. Chế có yếu chúng mòn hữu ra gì đó cô. Cô xử có con dũ cô, chế yếu dân đua. Khó con chế cũng đã luôn chế mua thua cô. Jialia woke the next morning, and she was in her chamber with the fire burning. Warmth and comfort was around her as she sat up in bed, staring at the fire and the tray of food that was by her side. How did she get here? She stood and got out of bed, her hair tangled around her, as she thought about what had happened. And then she remembered how Shofeng had given up on their relationship, and she broke down. She felt the hot tears stain her cheeks, and she gasped for breath, her heart breaking and feeling as if the world around her had crashed down. She heard the door open and her mother walked in to hold her. The embrace caused her to cry even harder. Cô Nia, cô yêu cháu nên nhớ chỉ một số cân là nè. Nhà vì lý cha nữa không có của cho chê nọ. Ôi cha nữa chỉ ô tèo lý nữa hai chê. Nữa chỉ lúc của lỡ tia, she cried. Her mother held her tightly and replied with a broken voice, "Sao tôi xia của tôi mình sai rong, số kinh chỉ lúc có là chúng mua của nhớ đó nè, của mà lý lúc có, nữ nè đu sinh tia chẳng nhớ nó toàn trọng nữ mà." Của nè, "Giờ cô đã chỉ chậu, của chậu có thứ nọ, khi của sao?" Chỉ sao giờ sao tôi năng pay trong liên đạo lọ mình sai, nữ chỉ nhớ có bóng nó của mà nè. Her mind ran with the goodness of his love and how he had hungered for her through the times when he stayed behind enemy lines just to keep her safe. Her heart wept, and she couldn't control her pain as she held on to her mother and cried her heart out. The afternoon sun was high in the sky when Shoken came out of his tent to find his men at arms preparing their horses. The sound of horse hoofs was heard, and he looked up to find his uncle making his way toward him, with one arm missing and a wicked smile on his face. Shoken cried out his name and ran toward the man as he fell from his horse. "Dalo! Gusaten che con zilla," he cried. "Me too. Kuchito yong ya. Cha kusha. Ya yota." His uncle's face had some color as he watched the man sip some tea and eat some food. Shogun couldn't believe how it was that the man had survived, and now he knew that only a man like Yetu could make his way back from the depths of hell. "Katararudula?" he asked. Shogun looked away. "Gusanu daramdanu zila." The king jerked his head up and asked, "Vidiga?" Shogun stood and took a deep breath, his heart heavy with the truth. "Vì hai tia ya tận tây nó, tụi này cũng thiệt giấy từ nửa bao theo lúc chấp là không thể tên." What I get to nodded in understanding. "Cũng chẳng chỉ tao hai tia, nửa gì ở tàu lên đó đâu có." Shogun's teeth clenched as he said with utter shock, "Chỉ do nửa gì. Nửa ya tu sơn để nửa gì isha, khai cố đã lâu. Có bảo đã chỉ xong đó, nửa hóa tài thơ rồng." The king touched his chin and then he sat down, his mind seemed boggled. "Ta lý có bảo mà, nửa hóa tài thơ rồng chỉ mà đã chỉ ở giáo thơ. Thảo hóa tài men mua cho có một bỏ, có những bỏ chất trắng hay tại hiện nửa hóa tài thơ rồng lắm." Shogun let out a deep breath. "Cô những bỏ trắng. Nhưng ở đây cô chính lo hành vì cô sao chỉ cho hai tia ở trong này nọ. Cô trả từ kế đồ là, cô chỉ sao cần trả lên giúp cô. Vì cô ấy chậu cho kế nọ. Cô sự cần đến giúp cô vì cô lòng xia. Để xì mi tô, thầu tên nọ tiết ta là. Giờ có trọ một cho có tụi ta ra là. Chạy ở nhố hẹn. Cô sao, có yếu kế là." He rubbed his face. "Đã lâu. Cô lúc này cô yên chân tàu tiệt, cô yếu chủ nhỏ ý lần xưa, chỉ xong một lần từ lọ cổng mà chạy ở trong trà. Giờ cô chế từ trong lên chạy lại lọ cổng cô lúc này, thầu cơ từ yếu gần nữa xem mót sắp lời yếu giờ cô. Cô như sàn tàu hành lợ. Cô lúc nữa cha khó qua hai tàu. Chế cô yếu ủ chỉ tàu, do nước bóng của mua. Khỏi trong trà, chạy kia nơi khí đó cô. Thế kia ứ nhiều một nhà lần ra kể." His uncle laid a hand on his shoulder. "Shocking. Ô nên nhỏ chỉ mong từ sản nhỏ ý lần đó kìa con rùa. Mua rồng xin gỡ, là chừng chờ tú kỳ. Mua rồng tú kỳ, là chừng chờ rồng xin gỡ. Sao mua kế bao kế kỳ xia cho là sai lo. Giờ có trò có tụi ta ra mồ lên nói mới chậu kế kỳ xia thầu cơ. Tụi yếu mua kế ra gì chỉ tàu, yếu giờ có tụi kinh. Cô chỉ xá bỏ có ô lúc nâng đó kế cô xì." Shokin felt hot tears rush down his face. "Đã lâu. Cô sẽ đi trả lò, cô sao kế tự ta lợ. Giờ cô chạy tôi nâng qua phê đó cô, giờ cô giờ chê cô bỏ cô sẽ ôn chua. Nếu yếu ở ra gì tao đó cô. Chế sao kế lúc và thấu nửa bố đó cô kè. Yếu lòng quấy sao kế chú trong một bức chất tìa li. Cô mất xá đi trả lò, cô như chỉ bảo yếu ở trả lợ. Chỉ kia này xa hay tìa cô như chỉ lúc nữa lợ tìa. Còn nếu khởi sao kế chú và li cô plạ sao kế chua. Ôn đây cô biết cô lúc hợp hìa. Cô như bảo sao kế chua mất xem bảo li trả. Mì tu. Cô bà tao xa hay tìa. Sao kế cho lửa tụ cho xìa. Bởi vì tế tao cho nhà hổ có lúc nâng mà. Cô bà tao xa cho hay tìa. Có ô lúc xìa lo ấy ra gì chứ. Rồi rong đùa." He turned to his uncle and with a saddening tone replied, "Đã là cũng như xã cơ lợ. Thật sự cũng ra gì đó lúa tụ sát tao. Ấy lúa chỉ ra gì đó cô ấy lúa. Trời cho cũng ra xìa sân ấy. Cô yếu ua cô lúc nâng xa cáo một dân lúc tử." His uncle smiled and replied, "Me too. Cô chỉ xa cả con gì có lúc kia nhau một trời tụ chỉ nhau mà. Có tụ bỏ có gì bà cho nhà hậu nụ lúc nâng. Nếu có chịu rong sai, có yếu tàu có gì tụ nâng tờ. Ta xin nó có tụ plá có tụ ta ra lợ, yếu có tiêu mù có yếu plá có tụ khen. Thầu nó cho gì có tí đó là bỏ, cho cá lần do tàu, cho cá lần chậu chạy có tụ lào lợ. Cô thọ có mà mình tụ, sáu mua tên nó cho là ua lúc chờ mò rồi có. Cho cá lần chở có xa xìa. Shokin broke down and fell into his uncle's arms. Nia, yếu yếu nữ tư, cứ lưu xuyên mà lưu chỉ mò là. Tia cô sáng bảo tư là cô nhìn cho tàu Shokin chê. Nia, cứ khai cô xế, cô yếu ô lý kia thế là yếu bá tàu của tụ kinh. Jialia's mother watched her daughter sitting in the sun, pale as the moon, as she stared at the invisible wind before her. The weeks that led up to her self-destruction of losing her husband had sent Bania on an angry haze. She hated Shokin for what he did, and now the idea of killing him was easier to do than before. Ôi chả có yếu chỗ lo lì. Shokin tôi chỉ lưu có là nè. Cho chế tôi nâng chỉ nhỏ lên nó, tôi chỉ nhỏ lên ở mình giải. Chỉ nâng một chấm một tàu ôi chả có yếu xíu mua lo lì. Có muốn đeo nhỏ tôi chỉ tao tệ có sự xíu mua tan thọ có lúc xíu có lúc rửa bút nữa lo. Có chỗ là con trai nè. Jialia turned to her. Nè, chắc cũng không có thở. Rồi lấy con giúp Shokin ở lo lì. Yên là tao đã chỉ xấu có. Ủa đã chỉ xấu cú. Có chỉ mua không mua bỏ là chả nè. Nè tôi nhẹ con đã cũng mua là nè. Để xí tôi chỉ hơn nè nhẹ cũng mua nè. Yêu cũng xí nè ở lần bỏ rong mốt của đâu nửa thầu bí nè. Bana's anger took over her, and she slapped her daughter across the face. The shocked expression that presented itself in Jialia's eyes made her even angrier. How could her daughter be so stupid as to completely given her entire being to this man? This man didn't even deserve an ounce of her love. Cả mua tan thọ có tổ kinh trong nửa lại trong nát chi nọ. Nụ nọ nửa đó sai có tôi giờ để khổng chứ mua nung gì. Nửa nọ giàu cái nửa thua có lỡ là mà. Ôi chả có yếu chỗ luôn chẳng phiền lo giàu nó cô ở đâu đi hết chị. Sợ là mà. Chỉ có lúc khó mua hai tiền thì ấy tôi nên pay. Lưng nhà pay thì lưng tôi payอย่าง เก่า. Jialia watched as her mother turned and walked off. Her last sentence made her confused, and she sat wondering what it meant. It sounded as if her mother was jealous every time she spoke of Shokin's name. Could there be more to this than she knew? She stood from where she sat and wiped her eyes, her heart still broken in pieces, and stared out beyond the water that rose down below. Where was he? Was he safe? She stood and walked to place her hands on the ledge. Just a few feet below, and her pain would be gone. She wouldn't have to wonder why. She lifted one foot and then the other, feeling the wind blow against her hair. Just a few feet below. Để tay nó mua chơi luôn trên mua rong gấu ya cả lu. Sớm mà mua cả luôn trên mua chơi tàu để tay mua nó mà cô tụi mi ta ra. She turned and found Shokin emerging from the forest wearing all black. She dropped back to the ground as he made his way to her. He looked as if he had been in pain, and she didn't know what to do. Should she run to him? But when he opened his arms, she let out a cry and ran into him. The embrace healed immediately the pain that lingered inside of her, and she felt her tears rush down her cheeks. Shokin, he kissed her hair. Cô thought gì? Muốn tao ya cô sẽ khai co. Mua she hậu đồ cô mà. Thọ cân chân cô. Cô yếu đặc lo cho co. Thật she thọ cân chân cô. She pulled away from him and looked up into his eyes. Oli, cô man chân co. The evening consisted of Jialia eating quietly with her parents beside her. The encounter with Shokin left her feeling as if the hole in her heart had healed. There were things he left unsaid, but she had to trust him. She had told him so. He had asked her to monitor her mother's actions, and when he said this to her, it made her question him. But she thought about the reactions her own mother had given to her when his name came up. It added up a confusion that met her own thoughts. Something was going on here that she did not know about, and Shokin was asking for time to figure out the truth. She watched her mother's actions, eating quietly and elegantly. This was a very dangerous woman, she finally came to conclusion. When they finished dinner, her mother asked her to take a walk with her in the garden. The roses were blooming, and she was reminded of Shokin's mother. Jialia said, as she touched the pedal, but to her surprise, her mother snorted and angrily tore the head of a rose off, throwing it to the ground. She asked. Nia, she rolled her eyes. Her mother remained silent, and the expression became dark on her mother's face. She simply turned and left her standing in the garden by herself. Something was not right, and Jialia followed her mother, where she found her going down the dark cellar stairs to a room that she had never known or seen before. There, she watched as her mother sat and cried, and then she opened a box and removed a satin scarf and held it in her hands. Titia, yo chuyaku onidu tasha. Tinisi. Soya ya tinisi, ya kuchi uaga ka tu tola ka kake. Teneng na ku yu shuka. Jona ku chu uaga ku yen ka su telita. Jalia's heart sank, and she stepped back quietly, her eyes disbelieving what she just witnessed. As she opened her mouth to speak, a hand covered over her and took her out of the dark room. She was released once outside, and she turned around to find Shokeng staring at her. She threw her arms around him, and he held her, kissing her hair. Shokeng, Gu, Guchito tao, she whispered. Ya ori tia, o ya rongli na. He pushed her back gently. Gutasi, so ya yati kusu. Guchi saga ka tushia, guteli ya ka taka la pa ka chang, de ka lo ka mo kia. Tu neng ku mu pa tho ho tai meng mo khi ke ra ku. Yakania. Jalia's heart sunk, and she sat down, her shoulders heavy with confusion. She felt hot tears roll down her face. Gunia. Gunia yalang titia. She looked up. Gutsi babao. He knelt down to her and touched her cheek. Dali kupa. Gutsi chupao ka cheng zang de gania. Guchin ka shia de gania lu ha pia ya ra chi tia. Guchi ta wa ra chi cao lu gania ya ta la. Ka ku sa bao ya tia. Bo ya mo ra chi chi shi ro ke lao. De ya wo u chi bao za. She thought for a moment. Itzi gunia yin chi pu ku yo ka. De shi vie de ni wo chi ta guci. Ta shi no kia se gunia zu ka heng. Ta ku yo to chao ka gunia yin king ku ton thi. Guchin ka shia li. She reached out to touch his arm. Shocking. Có sống mau tới giờ lấy có lúc xa. Giờ cụ trơn thì có tao cả chân. Mua xe hợp bố của mò. Cô mình thì có tao cả chân. He smiled and nodded. Oli.แต่she giờ lấy nó có yếu chúng ta cô những nhà có cho tuần chân hay để có thứ cũ ưu luôn nâng chỉ mua lợ. Cô những đủ đấy nữa có in đủ.最终你家了có yếu chúng chân của nó mò. 我知道我那时的地了讲，叫你叫我炖酒啊，炖狗也得是晒等待呢嘛，别买来熏鸡的啊。